Good morning from California, and thank you for attending the 2020 Femmes du Vin Harvest Seminars. We are on day one, and I am so excited to be your moderator for this panel, Natural Wines, Revival of Traditional Techniques in a Modern World. My name is Nadia Pugh, and I am the founder of Nod Wines, a digital community surrounded around natural wine started on Instagram, and assistant editor of The Wine Zine, a natural wine publication. These titles are new to me, given I've started my dive into the natural wine industry or wine industry at large just this year, but I've been an enthusiast for several. I'd like to personally thank Femmes du Vin for opening this door for me and inviting me to be here today. The previous panel on diversity has me so proud to be here today. So just before we get started, I'd like to review a couple of housekeeping items. The first is that this session will be a total of 90 minutes, 60 minutes for discussion and 30 minutes for Q&A. To submit your questions for the Q&A session, please utilize on your screen the Q&A chat box. These questions will be queued up for me to present during the Q&A portion. Feel free to send your question in during the panel so they're not all coming to me all at once at the end. Lastly, just a friendly reminder that donations are accepted at any time, today, tomorrow, and they will be accepted at femmesduvin.org. Your donations go directly to the Femmes du Vin Scholarship Foundation, supporting women in wine, obtaining education, and other opportunities. So, we're here for natural wine. I'd like you to think about the first time you've heard of natural wine, or maybe even the first time you tried natural wine. What were your thoughts, your reactions? The first time I had natural wine, it was a sensory experience like no other. My interest quickly grew to passion. Over the next hour, we will explore the definition of natural wine, the trend versus tradition debate of this winemaking style, and the current marketplace for these wines. By the end of our session, our hope is that you walk away with an understanding of this special sector within the industry. So let's meet our panelists. Our first panelist is Pascaline Lepeltier, Master Sommelier, and she's a Manhattan-based sommelier and partner at Racine, New York. In 2017, her wine list was named one of the best wine lists in the world. The best wine list in the world. In 2018, she was the first woman to be named France's Best Sommelier. Among other accolades, she teaches for the International Culinary Institute, the Court Master of Sommeliers, and the Wine Scholar Guild. Pascaline also writes a monthly Tribune and is preparing to release a book in 2022 and makes a little bit of her own wine. Hi, Pascaline. Our next panelist is Isabelle Legeron, Master of Wine, and she's the founder of International Community Raw Wine. This personally is so exciting for me. Since 2012, she has brought awareness to natural, low intervention, and minimal intervention wine through international festivals in London, Berlin, Los Angeles, New York, and Montreal. And just before we started, she just said that they announced Toronto. So exciting. She was France's first female Master of Wine and one of only 409 Master of Wines in the world. She is also a published author of Natural Wine, an Introduction to Organic and Biodynamic Wines Made Naturally, and advocates for transparency in the wine industry. Last but not least, our two other panelists are the Grape Witches, Krysta Oben and Nicole Campbell. Krysta and Nicole are sommeliers based in Toronto. Their Instagram and wine events have promoted natural wine education and helped create culture around natural wine as it is today. They've recently opened Grape Glass, a wine shop and lounge in Toronto, and Grape Witch Imports, an import company focused on small producers. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the panel. Is everyone ready?
Ready.
Cool. So our first question, what qualifies as natural wine and why do you think there is no legal definition at this time? We'll start with Isabelle for this one.
Sure. So, as you've just said, there's no legal definition. So I will give you my understanding as to what I would regard as a natural wine. So first of all, it's a wine that is made, using grapes that are organically and biodynamically, or basically naturally farmed. And then those grapes, when they come into the winery, they are fermented and vinified all the way to the bottling stage, without adding anything or removing anything. So I would say that that's for me, that is what I call a natural wine. Now, there's also the human element. It needs to be made on a human scale, by people who have, I think, a philosophy of looking after the environment, of a philosophy of caring for the plants and for the living. So I think that it's these three elements: it's the farming, the vinification process, and then obviously the people behind it. And I will just add one thing, which is that not very many people actually make wines like this. It's only a few hundred people in the world who do it consistently. So I think people who add a little bit of sulfite during the vinification process, or at bottling, for me also make, I would say, wines that are naturally vinified. So we can expand that definition a little bit, I think, to include people who will add a bit of sulfites during the bottling stage. But strictly speaking, a natural wine is nothing added, nothing removed, and using organically grown grapes. For me,
Pascaline.
Yeah, no, I think having Isabelle starting on the definition is very important. And I think Isabelle has been summing up a lot of very, very important points. Like we talked about natural wine, so obviously the idea is always to start with a final product. And sometimes, unfortunately, focusing too much on the final product and says that's nothing added, nothing taken away, no chemical additives that's going to change the structure of the must, eventually some physical intervention that are going to do so. But it's such a narrow way of thinking about this incredible thing that is natural wine, that is taking back to an idea of farming. And more than farming, it's an idea where we take from the vineyard what we can give back to the vineyard. It's another different view of production, where there is an involvement of regeneration and taking care of the land that allows us to grow things. That leads us to the social part that indeed has been, I would say, not as much put forward in terms of such an important part of the natural wine compared to another, I think, problematic issue, which is sulfur, that took so much of the debate, when at the end that social part, and the reason why a lot of the growers we know went back to do this type of farming was first and foremost because of the special relationships they wanted to have with their land and the people they were working with and the people they were making wine for. And the human aspect has been really forgotten towards little details. In terms of legal definition, I think the fact that there is no legal definition comes from multiple points, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about what natural wine kind of went against over its history, the current way of why people decided to go back that way. Again, quote-unquote conventional wine. And there is definitely an idea about a certain intellectual relationship to the product and what they wanted to do with that. But I want to point out that I think one of the huge issues here is there is also a very vague legal definition of what wine is. We have a very basic definition, especially in the countries that follow the OIV, that wine is made with crushed grape juice. But then wine is still, especially in Europe, and Europe is, whatever I want to say, the center of natural wine due to the volume of production and the history. There is still the big problem of wine having this exceptional status in European legal definition as a processed product when you don't have to list the ingredients. So I think, and that has been an issue and has been addressed as a European status for a while. But I think a lot of the debate we're currently having about what we can add or not add in a wine could be solved if conventional wine had the mandatory obligation to put ingredients on labels. And that's something that Europe hasn't been authorizing. There is an exception now since decades, and it's still not in the pipe. So that legal definition, why is so complicated in a way, it's because overall that transparency we're all asking for is not supported at the highest legal level. So nothing added, nothing have taken away. Regenerative farming, or an idea of taking from the land when we can give back to the land, and putting back the human relationship at the forefront of the production.
Thank you, Pascaline. Krysta, would you like to add anything to that?
I mean, Isabelle and Pascaline are exactly right. They're the experts that we've been looking up to, and they've been teaching us about natural wine for years. Nothing added, nothing taken away, maybe a little bit of sulfur to get it across the sea to end up in Toronto on our wine lists. But really, I think that's a simple definition of natural wine, just looking for more of a connection to nature and the people who make these wines.
Thank you, Krysta. Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of the previous speakers have really spoken to that. And I think one of the most common questions we get sometimes from older gentlemen is like, what? You're saying that other wine isn't natural? And that's a question that we're like, yeah, that's kind of exactly what we're saying. And I think that the misconception would be solved so much by what Pascaline said. We're always educating consumers about all of the ingredients that can be in wine. That as a consumer, like, you're so used to going to even a fast food restaurant and seeing an ingredient list, and that you don't have that transparency in wine makes it so hard for the consumer to realize what really is a hand-grown product and what is something that is mass-produced. So.
Thank you, Nicole. You know, I feel the same way. As I've really got into natural wine and I'm trying to introduce more of my friends to natural wine, I think that's probably the first thing that I get. What is natural? What is it? And, you know, it's made out of grape juice. Isn't all wine made out of grape juice? Of course it's natural. And then, I mean, it just trickles down from there how many things we have to expand upon and discuss. I mean, honestly, open up a couple bottles of wine. It'll take me a while to help explain that to others. For those of you just joining us, kind of trickling in, welcome again. The hashtags actually for this event is FDV Harvest 2020. And please tag Femmes du Vin on all your social media sites. I just wanted to make sure everybody had that information as we go through today's panel. And so, you know, I was listening to what Isabelle, what Pascaline, Nicole, and Krysta, what you were saying. And, you know, really the term natural wine reflects not only the finished product, not just that bottle on the shelf at this boutique wine shop or a bottle on the list at a restaurant, but it reflects the entire process from vineyard to bottle. Let's discuss how natural wines are more than a beverage and the importance of this in today's market. We'll start with Pascaline.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think one of the good things with natural wine is that, in a certain way, it put back the wine in indeed a relationship that we kind of lost, I would say, especially when wine really became a processed product, thanks to technology. So a lot of new advancement in both farming and in the cellar with energy tricks move the wine from this unstable fermented beverage to something way more stable that we can ship and control over the world. And we kind of forget that wine was way more than that, but that's been always the case. You know, the beginning of humanity, if you read a bit about that, Homo sapiens was Homo imbibens, you know, we were like drinking wine from almost day one. And we're also drinking wines that were probably also made with a lot of additives at the time to kind of process and keep the wine. So this idea that wine is a deep part of the culture of a lot of culture all over the world, part of as an alcoholic beverage, but even more as a grape beverage, I think is something that got forgotten, and that was kind of that reaction that we saw in the late 70s and 1980s, that it was a moment also of a lot of evolution in the consumption. Wine was not really anymore on the table as something you were drinking in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you know, in addition to your calories, like that daily bottle of wine in a bottle. And we moved from that, the way people were daily drinking shifted. We saw that, we were still seeing that in Europe with all the number of consumption dropping, and wine became something of a kind of a very different status that led to thinking of what's going on there, what's really going on. So I think now like the title of the seminar is very interesting because we are talking about like ancient technique and modern things. I think we are now in a postmodern thing, if I may be using a tiny bit of philosophy around what we are doing right now. I think the current state of the natural wine movement is fantastic. It's kind of reaching out to some things that we kind of felt we lost, that relationship to direct pleasure, to drinking that wine with a connection to nature, maybe in a slightly idealistic way, the way maybe we think that it was done, you know, in the 50s and before that. But then we had a whole something we can't ignore, that's all these technological improvement, industrial improvement, marketing improvement, and something very key, which I think is the evolution of the way we talk about wine. We critique the wine. So like that exploded with the scoring, and we have to describe the wine and analyze the wine. And it was not, that used to be just a case for certain specialists making the wine, but now we had all these judges and wine journalists and all of us, like, and that exploding in the 80s, 90s, and 2000. And what we are seeing today is a kind of taking the best of both worlds in a certain way of like learning from from this world, that going back to saying, okay, we went way too far into how we are taking control both of nature and that physical phenomenon of fermentation. But also today, we want to be able to talk about the wine in a different way. We want to market this wine in a different way. We want to be free on ourselves from the critiques and the sense of analysis. And so we are seeing this extraordinary creativity towards how do we talk about the wine, how do we want to describe this one, which label do you want to see, you know, like exploding kind of a punk rock attitude almost. But at the same time, you want to ship the wine on the other side of the world, which was not necessarily the case in the 1450s when you were like just drinking local wine. So I think we're today in a really very fascinating moment of the natural wine market. Fascinating because you get the best and the worst, and we are seeing the worst happening, which is this movement of clean wine and using all the tricks and the like these marketing tools up to a point to now to blur the line. You know, this is a little bit where we are right now. So it's a fascinating thing, and that's I think as well as the market today is more confused than ever, and that confusion I think leads to something that is needed, is to move over kind of a dichotomy of natural versus conventional, or natural like sulfur versus no sulfur, to understand that there is scales, like there is nuances everywhere. And if we really care about natural wine, we need to understand that every single winery, every single relationship from winemaker to his grape is a unique biotope. It will be unique. It can't be compared to something else. And we need to accept these nuances. When you accept that everything is different, when we're in a world that, in fact, everything wants to kind of be the same and fit in a box. So it's a bit where I am today. So yes, it's an absolute overall process, that it's a new relationship to nature, I would say, that we are invited to reconsider, as well as a more cosmopolitan, international, global. So how do we connect that uter specific to a very specific place to the global, to this extraordinary spread?
Thank you, Pascaline. You brought up a lot of different points that I'd love to circle back after we hear from the other panelists. There were just so many things that just light bulbs and aha moments going off in my head while you were speaking. Isabelle, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I mean, I think this was a very comprehensive answer, by Pascaline, and I would say I agree with, everything that Pascaline has said. I think for me, what I find really exciting now is and what natural wine has done, the way sourdough bread, the way the food craft movement in a way has brought to us, is that people are longing for a deeper connection with nature, and I think one way of expressing that is to delve into the world of natural wine, is to meet the farmers. I think for I don't know, I would say 30, 40 years, we really have sort of hidden behind the label, the bottle, the critiques, the intellectualization of wine, I think has been really detrimental. I think people have felt for a long time that unless you knew about, specific terroir and specific appellations and specific vintages, then only then you could understand wine. And I think now there's a move away from that. And I think, don't get me wrong, I'm a product of very classical training. And I think actually classical training and understanding your terroir and your vintages is important because it helps you sort of paint a picture. But I think what's really refreshing, I think, with natural wine and the farmers now, being able with social media, for example, being able to very easily communicate directly to the consumer, to the wine drinker, photos of the way they harvest and the vinification process and the biodiversity in the vineyard. I think for me, I find that hugely exciting because suddenly wine is not just a glass bottle with an obscure liquid, but suddenly we are able to appreciate, the vast amount of work and the painful amount of work that goes into making wine, and then the incredible risk and then the incredible precision that you have to, have in order to craft natural wine. So I think natural wine for me has always existed. It's been 8,000 years since we've been drinking and making wine, and ever since the beginning we've been making natural wine. And what we're seeing now is a return to appreciation of biodiversity and all things alive. If I speak to my grandmother, who all my family have always been great farmers, if I talk to her about the word biodiversity, she thinks I'm just inventing a vocabulary. When she was farming, biodiversity was de facto. They lived off whatever was growing in the vines. And I mean, that may seem like a romantic notion, but back then, this is kind of like you relied on growing all sorts in your vineyard or whatever was growing. Biodiversity was there. And now we don't have this biodiversity, and which is why I think, this reappreciation or this appreciation of biodiversity, of aliveness, of natural fermentation, of the environment, is finding, I guess, great resonance in today's market, because I think now people, not everybody, but a specific type of consumer will want something that speaks to them, that is true, ethical, looks after the environment. So that's kind of how I see. That's why for me, I find this what's going on at the moment, even though, like Pascaline mentioned, there are pitfalls, and as we become more and more popular, obviously the problems become bigger, and then the marketing issues and people saying they make natural wine, but they don't really make natural wine. So obviously, there's a whole raft of problems coming. But I think, when you focus on actually the positivity and the fact that nowadays, if you are a good farmer and you make true natural wine, it's very easy to find a market. Whereas in the 1980s or 90s, no one really wanted to buy your wine. So I think we also have to focus and look at, something really exciting is happening with how we control this beast now and what we do with it. That's important.
Thank you, Isabelle. Nicole.
Yeah, exactly what Isabelle was just saying. I started as a wine agent in Toronto almost a decade ago, which is how Krysta and I met, as I was selling her, I believe, like Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, and like Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Grigio at her restaurant, which 10 years ago was kind of all that restaurants were looking for, all that importers were importing. And it's really exciting how natural wine has just given people the opportunity to discover so much more. And we know that consumers are so interested. I think politically as well, like something that's been talked about a lot is how in the conventional wine world, what wine is worth is really established. Like if you're in Burgundy versus if you're in Slovakia, like the cost of that wine will be very different. And what really inspired me with natural wine is people in different countries being able to command higher prices for their wine, reach people that they never before would have reach markets that they haven't reached before. And it's such a exciting political thing to strip away some of the barriers of places and countries and get those really exciting stories that haven't been told into, for example, Ontario, a market that, 10 years ago, but even 5 years ago, we had none of these wines. It was a really different market. And now, thanks to people like Isabelle and Pascaline and all of these people who've come before us, people are demanding these wines and there's an appetite, and it's thrilling to be able to share those.
Thanks, Nicole. Krysta.
I think like everyone was saying, we're all looking for a more intimate connection to nature. The health benefits of clean wine aside, that's a little cringy topic maybe. But I think the more real conversation that natural wine invites us to explore is our connection to the earth and nature, to each other when we share wine together, and to the people who farm and make wine. I think that's what's driving us in the market.
Yes, I think that I agree with what you're saying, Krysta. Just something that really popped into my head as you were talking is that I think everybody mentioned relationship, and relationship being a common factor with natural wine. Not just the relationship between, the farmer and the vineyard, not just the winemaker and the grapes, and sometimes that's the same person, especially in natural wines, but also the relationship in the wine world. And that's something that I've seen personally, and I think that's honestly why I'm here today, connected with you all, is that there's a special relationship built on social media, on the internet, that the wine is not just, a bottle. There's a story behind it, and that story now can be reflected in retail, in wine lounges. And I actually want to hear a little bit more from Nicole and Krysta, since you guys just opened up your wine lounge and shop, a little bit more about how, I guess, taking those stories that you've told on Instagram through the Grape Witches and now translating them in a different way. I know you've done events, but now you're able to translate them in a different way in your own space, in your own shop. What do you think is your, I guess, role in all of this, role in the natural wine world in terms of, I guess, extending those relationships from maybe the internet to in person?
We're like passionate, nerdy cheerleaders of natural wine, maybe. I guess we see wine coming from from all places in our lives, in the same way that we see what we want to consume food-wise or the clothing that we buy. And we are quite excited and intensely focused on sharing that with people who don't work in the wine world.
Krysta and I started the idea for Grape Witches in 2016 after going to Raw, New York. And that was the first year where I'd been to wine festivals around the world, and it's always just like real wine professionals. And at that Raw fair, I was like, this room is full of consumers who don't work in wine, who are so interested to like nerd out about flavor, and they haven't studied for years, and they feel comfortable like asking these questions. And it was, we got back to our hotel room and it was drinking wine and really late at night. And we're like, I think that consumers don't want to just drink either super fancy Bordeaux or like go to a marketing of Argentina event, which is like no shade to the marketing board of Argentina. Like those wines have a place, absolutely, but there was nothing in between. And Krysta and I started really like just with parties, pouring interesting wines, and then quickly realizing that people wanted to talk about them. You can't just like pour a bunch of native grapes from around the world and you're like, just try it. And they're like, but tell me more. So that's kind of how we really started. And we certainly never anticipated having a physical space and a shop where we can do that more often. And one of the funnest things that hopefully we'll do next year, and like we would love to host some Raw events next October, or Pascaline, which is able to come visit us. But we've hosted probably like a dozen winemaker events where from the importing world, so often I would host winemakers and I couldn't get restaurateurs or sommeliers to attend a session because they're so inundated with great winemakers, and having consumers so eager to pay money to have a really passionate winemaker speak to them, like that just for me, is the most thrilling, exciting thing to make those relationships.
Yes, and as you were talking, I was just thinking about, really the culture in general. I believe that natural wine has a different culture around it. And I can't speak to other pieces of the wine industry because this is the piece that I am just so passionate and immersed in. But Isabelle, forming raw wine and really, raw wine is all over the world. You see the hashtag, the logo, I can see it in my head without ever attending one of your events. How, especially, I guess, speaking to this year, especially, this is a very different year for everybody across the industry, but in terms of keeping raw wine alive and the culture that you have helped frame and build around natural wine, how are you able to keep true and keep building upon that culture in today's climate, given the pandemic?
Oof. Well, that's a very good question. I'm not even sure we're managing it very well, to be honest. I think when my partner and I started Raw Wine in 2012 in London, it was always meant to be a little local event in London, and it really grew very, very naturally, very organically, and because the growers wanted us to go to different markets, and they liked the kind of the very professional but very relaxed and transparent atmosphere, because we make a big effort to sort of declare sulfite totals. If growers had sulfites, we get the analysis, so exactly how the wine has been made, and I think that environment felt very comfortable, and as a result it really grew very, very naturally, and in a way it has a life of its own, in many senses, because there are global community. It is a global community, but I think people, and we can see it here. So many people have been, and hopefully you'll be coming to one of the fairs soon. But so many people have been to the fair and met the growers, and then started imported a grower because they met them at the fair, and then in a way it's a web that kind of grew, and those relationships still exist, and I think what we really are doing to keep it alive, to be honest, I'm not doing a massive amount. We haven't really done a lot. In fact, Pascaline and I were discussing this the other day. It's like, what's next, in this pandemic climate. For me, I just want to prepare the best fair I can next year, best fairs. We're trying to make the website even better. So taking this time out to sort of like regroup and maybe do things, better next year. But, I think what's really important, and when I was hearing, all the, my fellow panelists here is, for me, what's really important and like in a year like this where obviously there's no income, there's not a lot going on for an organization like mine, and what's really keeping me going is the bigger picture, because I think it's it's easy to sort of focus on this grape variety, this winemaker, the fact they don't use sulfites or no sulfites or whatever, but what we're doing globally as a community is amazing and is huge, because I think we can change the environment. We can really change the landscape, and for me that actually is really what matters. Is somebody filtering, not filtering, finding, not finding? As long as we know about it, I think that's pretty inconsequential. But what's really important is when you go to a vineyard region and you start looking at the people who look after their land so well that it's bursting with life, bursting with colors, bursting with insects and birds, and that we as a community were able to provide a market for these wines and provide enough education and information so that people will pay a reasonable price, because we should be talking about fair pricing. No one can survive on selling a bottle of wine for €3 or €4 ex-cellar. It's because I think that's it's a big issue. Getting people to understand that making a bottle of wine naturally is expensive. And I think for me that's what's really inspiring, and that's actually what keeps me going. Is if collectively we know that we are creating a market where people can sell at a really fair price, that means they can grow, they can buy more land, they can convert more land from conventional to organic. then I think that in a way, you know, it's like, for me, that's kind of the motivating factor, you know, is really knowing that we are making a difference one bottle at a time, you know, and the rest is, you know, small details. But I think this is what, you know, and I think the work that everybody's doing, and then all the participants who obviously care about this, and all the people doing these wines, you know, that's what we need to focus on, is grow this and make sure that we, you know, we can, you know, expand the market. So then more and more young growers feel inspired that they can actually make a decent living, because, you know, it's not always easy. In fact, it's mostly very difficult, you know, particularly in this climate. So I think that's what's, I think, important for me. You know, there's a much bigger picture, and I think we can really contribute, and we do contribute, and we you know, we make a difference. And I think that's why natural wine is so precious.
Thank you for that. Natural wine really is, it's different. There's just something special about it, from, you know, the vineyards to the people making it, to the consumers, to everybody here today. Pascaline, being in the more, I guess, say, kind of like I posed that question to Isabelle, being in the hospitality restaurant business, being part of that part of the industry, what has, I guess, is there something specific that keeps you motivated and keeps things encouraged and running in light of the pandemic and all the changes that have happened here today?
I'm just going to follow what Isabelle is saying. I think it's time to put back natural wine and what that represents in a way larger picture of how we drink and how we eat. It's just the base of human being. We need to eat and drink better. Better in multiple ways, in a more nutritional way, in a more ethical way, in a way that is respecting the environment and making sure that there is a tomorrow that's coming up. I think there is a sense of urgency that sometimes we forget about, but natural wine has really been so important about shaking and saying, guys, what's wrong right now? Like, we are going into a wall. We are going into a wall, and the origin of the first guys, we're saying that, like, overabuse of nitrogen and potassium in a vineyard, we're just basically killing everything. So what Isabelle is saying about creating a market, saying that what you eat, the price you're going to spend for good quality products that have a taste, that come from a place, that can feed you in terms of nutrients, because we have to realize that most of the food and drinks we're consuming are crap. They are just like so deficient in terms of nutrients that they can't feed our body, but they don't even feed our soul. If you can't feed your body, you can't feed your soul. And one of the things that natural wine was able to do as a very specific product in the agricultural world is to say, there is an alternative, there is a solution, there is a possibilities. We can farm differently. We need to farm differently. It's possible. We know how to do it. It was done before. Let's get back to some relationship with the way we are dealing with the environment around us. Don't overabuse from it. And because wine has always been an agricultural product that could be monetized in a larger way with so many other type of crops, the viticulture is a symbolic part of the agriculture. The fact that natural wine can do it is saying, yes, there is an alternative. Yes, and can be a small grower. Yes, you need to pay the right price for this work, for this conversion, for the fact that I want to pay my workers also a fair price. We need to put back that in the center of our preoccupation. And I think this is also, I'm staying in this business because I deeply believe we can change our relationship to the world with the way we eat and drink. Not necessarily by schooling people coming to my restaurant. I don't really care about that. What I want them to do and feel when they come in the restaurant is just to test something that is so vibrant, so unique, that is so different that suddenly they are reconnected with something that is way behind their just pure analytic brain. They are reconnected to something that is very reptilian. There is something that is alive, that has a taste, and you're like, wow, what that? And you open the door, and suddenly they're asking, where does it come from? How is it made? Oh, it's made like that. Never heard that. And then you start something. And then you start to realize, wow, I've been surrounded especially in our Western society, by the capitalistic way of like the food industry, which is really, really disastrous. Suddenly waking up people to try to see that there is an alternatives. So I am with Isabelle. Like the larger picture is like, we are very lucky to be in a field that is fantastic. We're very lucky to be in touch and to learn from these farmers and to learn from these winemakers and wine growers since years. They are doing an extraordinary job. They are going against so much. They are going against, of course, the difficulty of growing, which is per se is very complicated, but also administration and lobbying and everything that is against them today to be able to grow well things and to survive from their work in the field, because very few people are ready to pay the right price for the right food. And it's not that expensive, it's just our budget is going to so many of the useless stuff. So this is, I am with Isabelle, and I'm so like, and everybody like Nicole and Krysta creating that market, making a sustainable market at every step, like rethinking the logistic, rethinking how we can be greener on that side, rethinking the packaging, rethinking how we mutualize help. We are here, we are all, I think, with the same energy and vision that we can really offer an alternative of an economic system based on a respectful environment and social ideal. And I deeply believe in that. And it's why I'm in a restaurant. You know, it's because I believe through restaurant, you can make people just open their palate to something new, and then we are on the back doing the logistic kind of for them. We connect people, we connect dots, we test with people together, we offer a new perspective of being in this world. It was a bit preachy.
Oh, no.
I'm sorry. Get excited on that.
No, we love it. And I'm sure everyone can appreciate that. Everything you said, there's so many pieces to that. I think a lot of us are looking for ways to, eat better. People can be very picky about the produce that they choose. They want organically grown produce, all of this, but maybe not thinking about those details in terms of the wines they drink. So there's a lot here. All four women here have spoke to a lot of points that, I feel everyone said something that we could just dive deeper in for another hour, but there's a lot here that I'm wondering how can we change, I guess, the future of it, because we built this culture, but we are absent from the formal education programs for natural wine. But this culture is just growing. And we've talked about, the argue between a trend and a return to tradition. Do you see a resurgence of natural wine leading to a change or addition in formal wine programs? We will start with Krysta for this one. Oh.
Hello. Formal wine programs often move at a snail's pace, but I'm very hopeful to see these institutions begin to move away from their classist and racist and wine is an exclusive product history. I think the way we talk about what's important in wine and what regions and grapes are valued and what techniques are necessary to make a good wine all need to change, especially when educating the next generation. I don't think natural wine is a trend that needs to be included in formal wine education. It's not just talking about a historical way to make wine and using old-fashioned grandparents' techniques. I think it's a necessary response to our environment, including the climate crisis and historic capitalist wine system that hurts us all. And I think if that becomes included in a formal wine education program, then that's a pretty good start.
Nicole, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I also, I think Isabelle spoke on this earlier. I was a product of formal wine education and going through the WSET program. And I love teaching. Krysta and I do a lot of teaching. And when I was able to start teaching WSET, I was like, great, I'm so excited to have these young students who maybe want to work in wine. And teaching the WSET 2 program was just so different than everything that we were talking about, and missing so many things about wine that made me so excited to be there, which isn't at all insulting that program. I benefited hugely from it and tell people to do it, but it just, I think that those institutions yeah, it's greatly missing, and it's been exciting to see. I know both Krysta and I, and I'm sure Isabelle and Pascaline as well, have seen this in their communities. I think that there are communities popping up of people offering different educational sessions. Like I know that there's an industry session going on today by a number of sommeliers in America trying to teach people about wine. So yeah, I hope to see it change, but it's also exciting in this time of social media to know that you don't need to be a big institution to teach people about wine, and seeing communities find each other has been a super inspiring thing, even during the pandemic as well.
Yeah, and Nicole, I know that you and Krysta have taken your time to educate people that come through your door as well. Do you see that, given age groups, do you see that there's any specific draw or know why there's a specific interest for millennials in natural wine? That tends to go hand in hand these days. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think honestly, we certainly have a lot of millennials, but also we have a lot of older people, like people in older age groups who come to our events as well. I think as the culture, people are learning more about it. People are just interested to learn more. And I think Natural Wine has done an amazing job of welcoming people in and having less, of a formal tasting grid that you need to follow. So people can just see wine as like what it is. It's a food. You can enjoy it and talk about it and really feel it in a powerful way without having to have any education at all. So yeah, I don't know if Krysta, you have any other things to add, but I really feel like who's walking through our door is increasingly a lot of people, which is exciting for us to have, really different conversations with different people.
Agree. I think it's people who are looking for, or who have felt left out by the traditional wine conversation and are still looking to drink some transformative fermented grape juice, but still have a nice time and a connection to what they're drinking.
Can I add something?
Of course.
I wanted to. I think there's progress being made my experience of the MS is, maybe Pascaline can answer to that, but, in my experience from the Master of Wines program and from the WSET, they have included some elements to deal with natural wine. I often get loads of questions from WSET students about research papers going on natural wine, and very often it's to do with trend and business questions. I think it's worth remembering that natural wine is 0.001% of the industry, and I think in a way when you are an institution or an educational body, you also have to make sure you cover, I guess, the vast majority of what's going on in the wine industry, and natural wine is really a very, very tiny niche element. And of course, it's worth, they have to cover it, but I think in fairness, I think people are making progress, and that it is being included. One thing is for sure is that when I was studying for the MW, and I was always a little bit of the wild card because I had ideas that were maybe a bit different sometimes, but there was never an issue of me expressing my ideas and saying, I believe natural, wine fermented on its own yeast is better than using, a certain yeast strain if you can back it up with argument. So I think, it is very possible to sort of go through quite a formal education and still, decide that actually natural wine is the thing that you want to do. So, I think a lot more can be done, but I do think that these educational bodies are trying to include it as as well in the curriculum, and maybe it's a bit slow, but I think maybe they're trying.
Thanks, Isabelle. We do have about 10 more minutes left of our live discussion session left, and then we'll be turning to our questions. So just a friendly reminder to everybody to queue up your questions. You will submit them using the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. So we'll get those ready. And I just want to turn to Pascaline. Did you have anything to add regarding the education piece?
Of course, I have something to add. Of course. Yes. So I'm going to talk on a personal level, okay? I've been working with natural wine for 15 years in restaurants, like serving natural wine, buying natural wine, tasting natural wine. They are extraordinary, but they are, I think, the most difficult wine to serve properly with old wine. Why? Because it's very easy to pop them up, and having some wines that go, as we all know, through phase, and just tell your guests, you know what, it's a phase. Like it's not, you know what is normal, like it's bready, is reduced, whatever you want. It's natural wine. I have a very hard time with that because often I was lucky to be able to taste that wine at multiple phases of his life, and I'm pretty sure the vigneron didn't want the wine to taste like that when I was going to pour it to the guest. He pretty wanted me to wait for the wine maybe to age 6 months or something like that to really show the best way. So I think there is definitely a need for education on the service side. There is a need of learning how to handle different expression that may require some time, may require no time, may require certain work on your dining room with certain glassware, playing with the temperature, forget about it, and all these kind of things. So there's two things I think and I can see that with a lot of young sommelier coming to the restaurant or working with me, where we have been taught, and I've been in a sommelier school in France, so you are just taught to open basically the wine and just pour it, and if there is some sediment, you decant, and if it's a big bowl young red, you decant, and that's pretty much it, and you serve your white at 8 degrees. So I think there is a lack of two things. First, there is a lack in terms of learning how to taste. Something usually you learn at sommelier school with very quote-unquote classic examples that are often very catch-all. You're very easy to analyze, but they're very far from the wine we're talking about that are taking you to so many different dimensions. So learning how to test them, learning how to talk about them, is not something you learn at school. And I hope it's something that we're going to have to do because they're just here on the market. And then also learning to work with them, because you don't work with them the same way. You really need to pay attention to the temperature. You need to pay attention to the pressure. I know I have one of, like in the attendee, I have one of my colleagues, Linda Milagrosio-Lago, and for a year we watched the pressure, the barometric pressure at the restaurant when we were tasting all this natural wine, and that changed, and I want to put that in the way I'm working to these new parameters that you're not taught at school. So hopefully there will be some change on that, just because these wine are here, they are here to stay. They are going to continue. And I think my job as a sommelier, it's to really make sure that the wine is tasting at its best for the vigneron, that is taking the risk not to make a wine in such a way, such a technical way that the wine is what I call a ready-to-drink wine, whatever the temperature, the time, whatever, the wine is going to taste the same. We are working with living wine, and my job is to make sure that the wine tastes the best according to what I think the winemaker wanted to show in his wine. So I hope, and I know that it's starting to appear, but this is really, I think we need to push. I think some of us that work or are part of educational program or institution need to suggest that there is some points here we need to talk about, because they are here and it's our job. I just want to remind you something. I was reading recently one of the first sommelier treaty from 1826 by André Julien. And at that time, the sommelier job, and until the 1950s, was in fact to bottle himself the wine. So the sommelier job was most of the time to really know when to bottle, if you need to filter, if you need to add something. Like that's awesome. There's almost nothing about service, but it's really about that. So I think bringing back the sommelier to a better understanding on all that kind of chemistry and more time with the winemaker to understand that part, and to make sure that the wine you are tasting tastes at the very best when you're showing it to your guest. So that's something that the natural wine, in a very positive way, can bring to more classic curses, and that will, for me, that will just benefit all the wine. It's not only for natural wine, benefit everything.
And so the last thing I did want to touch on, which Pascaline had a great transition into, was what are the differences? And I want to hear from, we'll start with Krysta. What are the differences between selecting, serving, and choosing natural wine versus conventional wine?
I think like Pascaline was saying, natural wine can often be and should be more expensive than what we're used to paying for just a regular bottle off the shelves. Like a $10 bottle from the local monopoly store is built to be shelf stable and always be consistent in taste and style. But natural wine is not that. So the education of knowing what you're tasting, to know when to serve it, like Pascaline was saying, is really important. And also storage is so important. And it's so rare in a restaurant or wine bar to be able to have the luxury of storing something for 6 months or a year, especially when you have investors breathing down your neck and asking you to, tell them how the wine is moving. It's a different conversation than what we're used to, and it's a slightly more expensive one.
No, I'm on mute. Nicole, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of those things, and just how challenging it is to kind of hold back those wines and how essential it is. And we could speak for an hour on our monopoly system here in Ontario and the pressures that puts on the agent and the restaurant, and how challenging it makes it financially for all of these people, and sometimes even legally. But yeah, I mean, in terms of service, what I have most noticed from moving from a more conventional position to working with natural wine is like, I spent a lot of time talking to consumers about what grapes were like in a blend. It's like people just wanted to ask me like how much Cabernet Sauvignon, how much Merlot were in this wine at consumer tastings. And I think one of the most thrilling things about natural wine is really instead at those tables, getting to have conversations, telling people about the stories of those places. And like Isabelle was mentioning, like how verdant and expressive those places are. And in terms of service, trying to communicate that joy and personal connection is what I most try to do when speaking with a consumer.
Isabelle, did you have anything to add with that?
Yes, I think it's really actually incredibly hard to work in a restaurant and wanting to serve natural wine, particularly like in Pascaline's case, when you work in I would say a fine dining, establishment. I was the consultant for a 2 Michelin star restaurant for about 5 years, and then I took on the wine list, and it was complete. There was nothing on that list that I actually would have drunk. It was really a very sort of typical Bordeaux heavy. All the very oaky Parker style stuff. Was there, and then but we had a clientele who would come in and buy bottles of wine for 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 pounds. And, as a restaurant, that's a very important source of revenue, as you all know. And converting this wine list to, 50% natural and everything else was organic, biodynamic, low intervention, and being able to communicate to the customer that it's okay that they can still spend the same amount of money on a bottle of wine because it's completely worth it, is incredibly hard, because you need I did some time on the floor, but obviously you have a team working with you, and you have to have sommeliers who are so committed and so hardworking. They have to be prepared to go and travel to the vineyards. You have to be prepared to go and visit, do the fairs, and be there really early in the morning, because we do training. Whenever there's a grower in town, the grower comes, we do like 1-2 hours, which a lot of sommelier work is like that wherever you work. But I think, it's being able to sell that wine, that natural wine at $150, $200, $300, $400 a bottle, $500 a bottle. There's an expectation that comes with that. And I think, that can be really challenging, and in a way you do need to have the team, and you need to have the dedication, and you don't really go into that job thinking it's going to be easy. It's like making natural wine. You don't do your 9 to 5, and you don't take the whole of August off and bugger off somewhere on holidays. It's that kind of dedication, and I think that what Pascaline says is absolutely right. You really need to know what you're talking about inside out, and how to serve it, and you need to know what's the expectation of the grower that, who've made the wine, so that you can actually best serve your client, but also best serve the grower.
It's its own ecosystem just within just natural wine itself. I'm hearing all these different, everybody has a role to play, even the consumer in their choices when it comes to natural wine. Does anybody have any last points to add before we move on to our Q&A? We have lots of questions and people are eager to hear more from you guys. Okay.
I'm going to just add something.
Of course.
No, but it's just take this moment of time in wine to really see it as an amazing moment to be more curious, to be trying to build up your own knowledge. Between the ease that we have now to connect with growers through social media or Instagram, to taste so many wines, just trust yourself. Like it's really for me also something that I find extraordinarily empowering, this moment, and to see how that we can make a difference individually as a community, and also thinking differently, which more than ever is really needed. And we can do it also discussing all together. I think what's also very strong with that is this ability to have a dialogue all amongst us. So I think it's super positive. As Isabelle says, there is all this negative. I think what this movement has shown is there is another way to relate to so many things, and to encourage us to have that experience and to learn from it, and to build that for us, like individual vision of what's around us. So it's a very, very positive moment. And like, thanks to people like Isabelle to have created this extraordinary event all around the world and carry the torch. And now Nicole, Krysta, like what's happening is so strong. We can't let it down. We need to continue, and we need to be precise. We need to be sharp. We need to be honest. We need to push, not just saying, it's just for the fun and all that. Of course, it's also for the fun, but it can be so much more. So thanks for this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And so actually in the nature of what Pascaline was saying, our first question is about that encouragement, empowerment, and pushing. So in the early days of the awareness of natural wine in the US, these wines came to be associated with flaws, Brett, VA, etc. How do we change people's minds about how natural wines taste? Does anybody specifically want to take this one on?
Yeah, I mean,
go.
No, I'll say something. I think it's important. I think it goes back to education. I think I often get questions from like a journalist will say, I've had such a flawed wine. I was full of VA, and if I ever was to sit down with that person and actually share that glass of wine and discuss the wine, you also find that people have very different sort of also tolerances to what VA or Brett is. So I think it's worth sort of, taking with a pinch of salt. But of course, natural wine, some natural wines have fault, and they can be mousy, and they can have a lot of VA. But I think it goes back to education. It goes back to getting people exposed, and having people to talk them through maybe what natural wine is, and also rediscover that wine. We're used to wine being very monotonous, and wine being very translucent and having very clear flavor profiles. That's because over the past sort of few decades, we've come to making wines that are very with a high level of intervention, with the same yeast, same temperature control. So in the end, we're used to squeaky clean wines, and I think it's important to maybe go back to thinking of wine like we think of food, and that actually there's such a spectrum of flavors, and it's important to also learn to respect the wines. And I think that's coming back to what everybody was saying here is we do. I think it's great to have, the glue side of wine, but I think when you start visiting the growers and spending time with the growers, you realize that, these wines are serious. Most of them will age beautifully for years, if not decades, if given the chance. And we're just used to sort of, in a way, being quite flippant, because I think that, it's the kind of the casual dining, the casual sort of, the wine bar scene that's kind of helped this explosion of consumption. But I think it's important to also think that, some of these wines are meant to be drunk now, in glue style, but the vast majority are actually incredibly serious. And we need to really push, I think, that side of wine. We need to help. And I think that's what I love about Pascaline's job. And I'm sorry, Krysta and Nicole, I don't know your work so well yet. But you can go to Pascaline's and taste wines that are 5, 10, 15 years old, and then you can appreciate their seriousness, because this is fundamentally, when you see growers, who use microscopes and who are incredibly precise in the vineyard, where every single vine is an individual, you realize, oh my goodness, the thing in this bottle is amazing. It's like a miracle. And I think it's worth, bearing in mind that it's not just, oh, it's cloudy, let's drink it. It's orange, let's drink it. But actually that it's, there's also that kind of very serious aspect to it. I'm not even sure if I answered your question, but I just, that's kind of, I felt that was important.
Yes, and thank you, Arnika, for your question. We have a couple others here. Let's see. This one's from Allison. Hello, panelists. Do you feel there are any risk in natural wines catching on in popular wine culture? For example, what if the larger wine producers recognize that this is a trend and adopt a marketing spin on their wines without actually adapting their practices? How do you support the makers that are doing the work when their production is so small and they are unable to enter the larger markets? I believe this question is very relevant today. Does anybody want to take a stab at it? I see Nicole nodding her head.
Yeah, I think that we've started to see that, and we've spoken about that already, and I feel like the first panel as well even was touching on this. I think one of the most important things, I think was from the first question, the fact that there is no legal, in Ontario and around the world, you don't have to have an ingredient list for your wine, so that you can some very smart marketing person can write an excellent label and kind of copy the style of natural wines. And as a consumer, unless you have an extreme amount of knowledge, it's really hard for you to know what you're buying, I think is, definitely a challenge that we will see, and is so much about education. And certainly as it expands and as natural wine becomes more popular, there'll be challenges that will arise like this, and with bigger wineries trying to emulate this and not treating their workers well, and how important fair labor is, and all of those conversations I think are so essential and are starting to really happen now.
Thank you, Nicole. Let's see, we do have another question from Olivia. I just want to make sure I'm getting everybody's in order. So from Olivia, the industry, let's see. The industry says that natural wines as a trend, the industry sees natural wines as a trend going mainstream, and it has reached its peak. Personally, I think this is just the beginning. From a forecasting standpoint, where are we at with this movement? And I think Pascaline did touch on that just before we entered the Q&A process, talking about, this is, we're empowered, and this is almost just the beginning. Pascaline, did you want to add more to that? Does anybody else want to take a stab at that question? I'm sorry, answering that question.
I thought Isabelle also touched about it. We are talking about barely 1% of the wine production, if it's not less. Maybe Isabelle, you can tell me on the numbers, but the number of wine growers we are talking about producing this type of wine is ridiculous in terms of production. So yes, it's going to grow. It has. There is no. It's going to continue to grow, and with the challenges we just mentioned, which is. Because there is a market, and it's nothing wrong with the market. if there is wine, there is a market. That's been the case since the origin of production of wine. Like, you read back something Olivier de Serres in the 17th century was saying, with no market, you have no wine. So you need just to find the right market, with more people inspired, with definitely more drinkers being inspired by drinking them. You can only grow. And just to talk back to what Nicole was saying, which is very important, how do we know? It's exactly the same way for anything else. It's like all the members of the chain need to be trustworthy. Because at the end, wine is a question of trust. You come to my restaurant, you need to trust me with what I'm going to tell you. I need to trust my distributor that himself needs to, or herself needs to trust the winemaker, because we can't be all together 100% of the time, and you need to trust me. So it's a question of trust. So you work with people you trust. So there is that human component. We are talking about the labor issue. Yes, I'm working with people I trust. They will take care of their workers as well as they are treating themselves. There is laws in country. I know there is very strict regulation in certain countries. There is not a strict regulation in other countries concerning labor, but I'm going to trust them. And do I want to work with people that don't treat well people? Absolutely not. Because at the end, it's all a question of trust. So if we build up the right way to sell the wine, to talk about the wine, to educate the wine, it can only grow. Because we know that at the core, the movement is inspiring so many people to farm differently or to go back to farming. So it's just the beginning. More whole wine fair everywhere in the world. Everywhere.
Can I add something to that? I think what's I think really fascinating about what we're seeing now, is that, and it comes back to the idea of transparency, is that this, for me, the natural movement, and to answer your question, Pascaline, I think we are way, way, way under 1%. It's like 0.01%. We don't really have the figures for it, but it's been really driven by the market, by the wine drinkers. The establishment doesn't have ingredient labeling laws. You have no idea what you let yourself into when you go and buy a bottle of wine. And I'm not saying there's the bad stuff happening, but you have no way of knowing. But what's been really fascinating, I think, is that the demand for natural wine has been really driven by a change in what people want to drink, and by people wanting to drink better, know more, by starting to sort of scratch open the door of like, oh my God, wine is not just grape juice. So what is it? And asking more questions, and then finding, these rhizomes, this underground world, where restaurants and wine shops, full of people with great knowledge actually can talk to you about these wines. And so I think this has been very much from the ground up, which is why I think it's very solid. It's really driven by a deep sort of thirst from people to drink not just better, but to know what they're drinking. And of course it's going to grow, because we're just at the very beginning. We're talking in terms of this kind of like renaissance, it's just 10, 12 years, 15 years ago, you didn't really talk about natural wine. So we're just at the very beginning, but it's been very much driven by people wanting to know more, wanting to, answers to what they're drinking, and growing. So it's not, I think it's just absolutely, it's just the very beginning.
Krysta and Nicole, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, like Isabelle says, we're still at the entry point where people are still asking, what is natural wine? And of course, it's something that we all want to discover. But it's exciting that now we're getting into the other questions, like who farms this wine? What is labor like? Wanting to know more about every step of production. That I think it can only grow from there. The more transparency and honesty we have, and the better wine we'll all drink together.
Okay. And I know we have about 15 more minutes. I have 3 more questions here, and I think more funneling in. So this question is from Tara. What is your stance on winemakers just starting out in the natural wine who don't own their own vineyards, finding at least in the US organic vineyards or old ancient vineyards, which represent sustainability, can be very difficult to find and source. Are you open to accepting those wines as natural if they are made in the cellar without additives, but that the vineyards are not certified or 100% are not certified or 100% non-certified grapes? It can be challenging to bridge that gap, even if the right intentions are there.
Yeah, I can maybe just contribute to this question, because I actually get a lot of people who you know, from the States, who want to be part of you know, the fair, and then, you know, one of the requirements is that you have to farm organically, and I think it's actually a really key question here, because when you are in California, where land is incredibly expensive, and where, you know, your only way of getting your foot in the door is just to buy grapes from a big farm who has no interest whatsoever in farming and, you know, organically, because, you know, they have a system that works and they make money, and thank you very much, you know, and they sell their grapes. So why would they change? And I think so I have a lot of sympathy for that, because in Europe it's a very different story, and land is a lot cheaper, and you can get started quite easily like this. So, you know, I think I've seen a lot of young growers who start by maybe buying, you know, conventionally farmed grapes, and then little by little will manage to find a plot, and then their name, you know, they get a little bit more famous, a little bit more money, and then they manage to maybe, if they want to, because some people might not have the desire to actually farm, to buy organic grapes, but, you know, and then they get a foot in the door, and then they manage to buy a little bit of plot, and then, you know, then little by little, I've seen so many young growers who are able to buy, you know, not initially, but over time, because they're very committed to find organic plots when it's possible. Then, you know, maybe if it's in a very difficult area, it's a different question. But for example, in California, and then, you know, they have then managed to convince, you know, the farmer to move over to organic, because actually they can maybe charge more for their grapes. In answer to the question, I would not consider this grower, this, you know, winemaker, a natural winemaker, if the wine that they made was not using organically farmed grapes. Certified or not, I think, you know, a lot of people farm organically, but they don't necessarily have the paperwork, but doesn't mean that it's not farmed organically, you know, as such. But I would consider a grower a winemaker, who can buy a little plot and make maybe one wine naturally using organic grapes. The rest is not in that same, and I would, and I have, and I do have, you know, let the grower come to the fair, for me, the winemaker come to the fair, and then maybe present one wine, and the next year maybe they have two wines, because I think it's really important to support, you know, these young winemakers, and give them a voice and encourage them, because if they can't sell that one cuvée that might be more expensive, then they're not really going to be, you know, carrying on, or they might not be encouraged to carry on in the organic way. So, you know, no, for me, they're not a natural wine producer, because I think very often we call a natural wine producer or a natural winemaker somebody who just makes wine the natural way, but we don't but we actually forget a lot about farming, particularly I think in the new world, where people don't really own their land necessarily. Sorry, the US being a new world from a French perspective. But, you know, but it is possible, and there are a lot of really great success stories of young makers who have managed to find a little bit of land that they farm themselves, and then, you know, little by little they get more and more. So I think it is actually really possible. You know, I've seen it many times, but I think it's really important not to say that they are natural winemakers if all the wines they make come from conventionally farmed vineyards.
Thanks, Isabelle. We do have a question from Madeline for Pascaline. How do we adjust the way we taste natural wine, both for us as wine professionals and in guiding consumers? Are there specific elements we need to approach with care and open mind, and what might we perceive that is not classic?
My dear Madeleine, that's a 2 hours question. So that's a very, very broad question. Couple of points. I think what we've been trained to taste are very technologically made wine. They are very well done. There is zero flaw. They are almost too perfect, with very specific aromatic and structure compound that are almost predictable, and they should be predictable because a lot of the wine we are trained to learn from made that way are made in this way to be as stable as possible, including this very big amount of sulfur. So I don't think we are used to taste aromas that are not as perfect pitch, like could be some done with very specific yeast strain or very specific winemaking techniques that gonna enhance very kind of monodimensional notes. And you get that one monodimensional notes after another. When you start to taste wine that haven't been manipulated whatsoever with no sulfur, we are talking about a different relationship, especially with the relationship to oxygen, to a lot of aromatic compounds that may not be as pristine, may not be as fresh or crisp, because this is a lot of the thing we are expecting, especially from a young wine. So there will be some work to do, especially on a winemaker, like tasting with winemaker, to relearn how these different compounds are evolving with this relationship to oxygen. I think the oxidor reduction thing is something we need to learn more. There is also the idea of faults. In fact, a lot of the wine we're tasting, you say, oh, that is a fault. We all know that is a scale, and there is a scale that needs to be thought as an overall perspective about the wine. And I think that's the second thing. We have been trained to really analyze a wine. It's an analytical testing where it's 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, and eventually then you form a whole, where I think we should take it the opposite way. That's a whole, and let's see how all the elements are working together, not in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality. Saying that the wine is high acid, what does that mean? Is it high acid because you have a lot of volatile acidity? Is it high acid because it's a cool climate? It was very cold in that vintage. The pH is so low, the acidity is so high, Malo couldn't happen. Is it something else? What is the feeling that I have in my mouth? So thinking as a whole. And I also think it's very important to think in duration. I think that one of the things I really enjoy working here is the ability to tell a guest or to test the wine really throughout, to don't test only on one tea moment, but really to see how the wine is evolving. And that evolution is going to be different for all this wine. This is always quite important to really be super precise with your glassware, super precise with your decanting, the temperature and service, and so on and so on and so on, because you have to fine tune every time. So in terms of what can we continue to do, I think expanding our register in terms of aromatic compound and what we are talking about, understanding this relationship with oxygen, which anyway is going to happen because we are dealing with reduction in oxygen in bottles, in winemaking and all that, and learning to forget about the analytic way, but expanding in a quality way, which is more complicated because we can't quantify it. We can't score it. It doesn't belong the same. So we can bring into our tasting other dimension, like, is kind of quote unquote caricatural word, but we need a new vocabulary for that. But the energy, the vibrancy, the feeling well, that are also for me very big part of what makes a great wine a great wine. But I'm working on it, Madeleine. It's going to be part of the book.
And thank you, Madeleine, for your question. And this is Madeleine Trifon, the first female master sommelier. So thank you so much for being here and participating in our discussion today. We do have a couple more questions, and I'm going to try to squeeze in before we wrap up today. And let's see, we'll go to Krysta for this question. This message is from Linda, and it surrounds language. And it's more of a comment. None of you mentioned this, of course, but related to Pascaline's comment about people taking the time to learn about and understanding wines. Can we stop talking about natty wines and funk being part of them? I am all for making wine accessible to all, of course, and that includes our language around how we talk about them. But it's still a beverage made with respect and good intentions, perhaps even more so than the most commercial and least expensive wine in the market. These terms can be dismissive and frankly works against these wines. Krysta, I know with your space and your piece of the industry, do you run into this? And what are your thoughts about these terms and these connotations of these words for these wines?
Well, I think Nicole and I for sure, and I'm sure all of us run into a lot of natty wine kids who are experiencing natural wine for the first time and maybe coming from a craft beer perspective, or they're new to drinking wine, and so they kind of latch on to maybe the things that we might consider faults or like wilder features like Brett and VA and like natty, cloudy dankness, which is super fun. But obviously natural wine, like everything, is a spectrum, and I think it's important to show natural wine, like we've all been saying, at its best, and to put it into people's glasses when it tastes delicious, and know our customers and know what cool young kids want to drink the cloudy dank stuff and what cool young kids want to drink the extremely fine, beautiful, precise Chenin Blanc from the Loire. I think there's a place for all these wines in natural wine.
Nicole, did you want to out Pascaline, Nicole?
I'll very quickly. I think that those words like funky or natty, Krysta and I see a lot of people who come into the space, especially, maybe they're from beer, which was felt like a more inclusive space for them to start their flavor journey. And they use those flavors as a positive and it can be a super helpful term for us to find a wine that they're going to really like. So it's certainly a term that, there's like no judgment on it. And we try really hard to show people like the huge spectrum of wine, but I'm really happy to meet someone wherever they are and find them a funky wine that's not just funky, but and as many other things. And very happy to use that term, although expand upon it for sure. Pascaline, to you.
Pascaline.
Yes.
No, I think it's a really great point, especially about the language of wine today. Especially us, like Krysta and Nicole, and you, Isabelle, in a little bit of a different way, but we are talking to people. And we are in the hospitality business, which means that I need to adapt to whoever is going to come through my doors. And the last thing I want is to start to throw knowledge at that person and make a relationship of power. It's the last thing I want. It's a feeling of welcoming and hospitality. So all of us have been talking, I think, in our different communities about the prejudices and the presuppositions of language. And I believe you have to be able to really exchange, and sometimes it goes through the vocabularies that you may not agree with right away, but if that person comes and there is maybe another way to talk about it, just use it in the discussion while you are respecting that hospitality dimension we need to have. That's the same thing when I was reading a lot of things recently about language and the fact that we're using and referring a lot to, it's a lot of metaphors, the way we are talking about the wine, because we are not suited in vocabulary-wise. So we are going to talk about things that is around our culture, fruit, vegetables, all that, spices, which is one of the ways to get into the wine world. And it's true that there is a lot of terms are coming from Europe, or like from this kind of area of the world. And I'm like, wow, so what should I think about using if somebody comes from another part of the world that don't have access to what I have? And this is where you are like, okay, I need to also continue to learn and discover what's in this other culture so we can really exchange. So when that person is going to say that, I'm going to, okay, that's something I don't know. Maybe I will research it and we can find a middle ground. The same with that person, we have to learn something I will talk about, maybe for a plant, a flower, whatever. I'm going to talk about the wine, and we are going to grow and learn together from the both culture. But in terms of what Linda is saying, I think today more than ever, we have to respect all of us as, like we see the big problem we currently have, especially in the US. And I think more than ever, being able to elevate a little bit the debate, and showing respect is so crucial. So crucial. So yes, we need to respect that. It's cool, yes, but it goes to a certain point. I have no problem that when somebody say, I want a wine that tastes like shit, I'm like, and people are telling me that. I'm like, you know what? I have some wines that going to tend to go with certain type of aromatics, but I will never say that about a wine because I know the person that made it, and I'm sure that winemakers don't want to say wine tastes like shit. Like I'm sorry. That's just trying to respect that the work of the person behind.
Thank you, Pascaline. We are just, we're going to go over, I think, about 1 minute. We do have one last question I'd like to get to. And this is from Yogi Weinstein. Hello. Arnica mentioned that the last WSET diploma research paper topic was natural wine. Have any of these research papers been published for public consumption? If so, where can we find them?
I wrote one of those just a few years ago. I don't think that they're published, not that I know of, but maybe someone else knows better. But in my experience going through that, like pretty recently, I think they're just marked and then they stop existing unless you self-publish them.
Okay, so they would have to be self-published. Well, I mean, we have touched on so many topics of natural wine, and I think we could sit here for the rest of the afternoon to really dive into each of these nuances. But I want to thank all the panelists again, Krysta, Isabelle, Nicole, Pascaline, for your time today. Thank you for Femmes du Vin for having me asking me to moderate this panel. We do want to make sure everybody does use our social media tags. Femmes du Vin, we have our tag Femmes du Vins and our hashtag FDV Harvest 2020. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We will resume next Monday, October 5th. And I believe one of the conversation topics of the day, if not the first, is vegan wines. So I think that's a great segue from some of the conversation topics we've had today to lead us into next week. So I want to thank you everyone again for your time today. Thank you attendees. We look forward to chatting with you all soon. Everybody here is on social media, so please reach out and we would love to hear from you. Thank you everyone.